Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Beth Ann. I'm heading up marketing at Continual, where we are building a platform for AI copilots or embedded AI assistants for applications. Here at Continual, we are, when it comes to using LLMs, doing that in a secure and responsible and compliant way is very much top of mind. So we're thrilled to be hosting this panel today with a great cross-section of industry leaders who are really working at the intersection of AI, including LLM technology and governance. So before I kick this off, just a few quick things. The chat is open for you to share any thoughts that you have throughout this discussion, any resources you want to share. Also, I would ask that if you want to ask a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function within your Zoom console. That'll just help us be able to really easily see whenever questions comes in for the panel. After today's session, maybe later today or definitely tomorrow, you'll receive a follow-up email with access to the replay and some links to resources relevant to today's discussion. So let's go ahead and kick this off. Let me quickly introduce everyone. We have Aparna Dhinakaran. She's the Chief Product Officer at Arize AI, which is an ML observability platform. Justin Norman, the CTO of Vera, which is a brand new company focused on helping tools for businesses to be responsible and compliant with generative AI and AI in general. We have Nicolette Nowak, Associate General Counsel and Chief Data Protection Officer at Beamery, which is a AI-powered tech management platform. And Tamara, Kneese, Director and Senior Researcher at Data and Society, which is an independent research organization focused on societal impacts of data, AI, and automation. So this should be a great discussion. I want to go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic, starting with you, Aparna, and if you could just, share anything else you'd like about your current role or your background. And then before you pass the mic, would love for you to tell us on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling about, in this era of LLMs, responsibility and compliance? 10 being you're feeling very confident, like this is easy, no problem. 1, least confident, this is a mess, and you're very concerned. And so give us that 1 to 10 and tell us why you feel that way.
Awesome. Well, I feel like you can guess my answer based off of why we're all on this panel today. But hi, everyone. My name is Aparna. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on here. Like Beth mentioned, I'm Chief Product Officer and one of the founders at Arize. I got into this, I have a technical background. I got into this because as I was a ML engineer for many years myself, deployed many models into production. And once they were actually deployed in the real world, we had no idea how they were actually doing, whether they were actually doing well. And not only do we care about how accurate are these models, but these models also had implications, especially things like credit, models that determine who gets a loan application, who doesn't. And these same problems are also being solved now with LLMs. And I think it makes it even easier to deploy these types of applications because it's easier than ever to actually put a model into production. There's all of these large foundational models that no one has to necessarily train that can be used. And so I think it's even more important now than ever to care about responsible AI development. And if I'm honest right now, I think we're probably closer to like a 1 or a 2. I do think it's a problem. I think the problems about talking about responsible AI is that first, there's so many different ML use cases out there. And so what does the definition of what responsible means for a specific use case is very hard to define. And so how do you define what's responsible, what's compliant, and who owns doing that in an organization? And then second comes, how do you properly measure that as through software or through even things like LLM evaluations? How do you do that is, I think, a conversation that's just not being talked about even enough. And so we need to start talking about it. And I think talking about it will start more of a process around organizations doing that. So excited to lean in and spend time with the rest of the panelists on this today.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so you're a 1, you're in like dumpster fire territory. Let's go over to you, Justin.
Yeah, hey, just like Beth Ann said, I'm Justin Norman. I'm the one of the co-founders and the CTO of Vera, and we're really focused on the safety component of things. A lot of things that Aparna said really resonate, so I'll probably reference them alongside here. But my background, I actually started off in government, so I was a Marine for quite a bit of time, and one of the first data scientists in that capacity, and was in a lot of situations where, quite frankly, I think we got out ahead of where we should have been from an AI use case perspective, and we had to figure out how very rapidly to put guardrails around it. So I went through that, similar to Aparna, went through the developing things rapidly, getting them into production, and figuring out the scaffolding, and realizing there wasn't a lot there for us, and that being done as a one-off was not only just discouraging, but also pretty dangerous, because you need a much more, I think, holistic approach to that, and a community approach. And so I got a chance to work in various different roles in industry. I've had basically every title from in software development and machine learning engineering, data science, and research science, and now really kind of culminating on the side of really focusing on building things for other users. And to answer your question directly, I'm a little bit more optimistic, and the reason why is I think today we actually have a lot more tools and a lot more people working on the problem than before. So I'm going to go with a 5. When I first started working on sort of alignment ML and AI, it was almost entirely just like the realm of folks working in the responsible AI community. It was only people who had decided that was going to be what they did. And of course, there's been a lot of things that have morphed in different directions about that, some controversy. But at the end of the day, I think we are recognizing that it's a problem, and now you're starting to see experimentation, research, technical solutions start to come out to try to address it. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. But I am encouraged that we're getting to a place now we're trying to build to try to address some of these challenges, and I think from there that's where you get innovation. So I'll be a bit more optimistic.
Awesome, thanks, Justin. Over to you, Nicolette.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Nicolette. I'm the AGC and DPO of Beamery. Beamery is an AI-powered talent lifecycle management platform. So we work in the hiring and internal mobility space. So obviously that's high risk already. So I come to think about a lot of the AI that we do in this kind of protected space, high risk space. And so I've been working a lot with our external counsel, internal counsel, and kind of looking at all the upcoming regulations. I think it's a little bit too early to talk, like everyone is talking about regulation, but there is no regulation really. And it's kind of all over the place. So, everyone likes to speculate on what's going to happen, but inevitably we kind of don't know until there's actually, pen on paper with regards to these regs. People have been talking about the EU AI regulation for years, and where it was a few months ago to where it was just today is very different. So it's very hard to speculate on regulations, but I'll be happy to give some of my thoughts later about what's coming up and how companies can stay compliant.
Great, yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into that. And what is your 1 to 10 scale?
Oh, sorry. I'm pretty bullish on AI. I think about our own technology. Obviously, like I don't have a technical background. Obviously, I'm a lawyer, but I think about our own technology and the promise of what it can do, and how we want to drive more diverse outcomes in hiring. So I'm pretty excited about that, and hopefully, if it works the way it's supposed to work, it really will drive those outcomes, and we'll see better results for humans. And so I'm pretty bullish. I'm going to go 7.
All right. Okay, and Tamara, over to you.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you all and listening to you all talk. It's interesting how, even though we come from very different backgrounds and are engaged in very different kind of pieces of the responsible AI landscape, I think we're really very aligned, which is great and maybe a good sign. So maybe I was going to say 3 in terms of my rating of the current situation, but maybe I'm like hovering at a 4 or 5 even, because at least we're having this conversation. But so my background is a little bit eclectic. I am currently the project director for Data and Society's new AIM lab, which is an algorithmic impact methods lab. And what's interesting about that is that it kind of relies on some of the pending legislation to become a reality in order for it to have many teeth, right? So at this point, we're kind of relying on companies or organizations that are open to hanging out with a bunch of critical researchers who engage in participatory methods and other qualitative and quantitative ways of kind of thinking about what an impact assessment can and should look like in a variety of different case studies. Before this particular role, I was on a software team at Intel that was focused on making green software. And I spent a lot of time talking to others in the sort of ESG strategy and compliance space. And I'm generally part of the kind of larger responsible tech community. And what I've been really actually excited by is the fact that, kind of aside from the regulation and compliance piece of thinking about how to build more sustainable and ethical technology, there are also a lot of developers who are activists and who are interested in organizing collectively towards creating better technology. And so I've also been involved with some of those movements, and am also sort of hoping that that can help build momentum towards turning regulation into reality. So that's a big part of what I'm really interested in, is the gap between kind of how you can hit the right metrics and measure success when it comes to things like ethics, which can be quite nebulous, versus, what are the technologies and developers really looking like on the ground, and how are they impacting marginalized communities across the product life cycle.
Wonderful. It's so great to have all of your different points of view coming together here. Thank you. So before we move on, I just want to see how the audience is feeling. So I'm going to share a poll here. Would love to know, how are you guys feeling? So on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you about building a responsible and compliant generative AI? So this is, we're talking about LLMs. 10 being no problem, piece of cake, been there, done that. 1 being, this is really tricky and I'm very concerned about this. I'll just give everyone a minute or so. So far, not a lot of 10s. And just a couple more seconds if anyone would like to chime in the poll. All right. All right, so it looks like everyone's kind of huddling around that middle, 50-50, I'm uncertain. And I think that, is not a surprise because to your point, Nicolette, especially when it comes to regulation, like it's taking shape as we speak. So I think a lot of people are just kind of, it's very early days, a lot of this technology is not really commercially deployed en masse, and we're kind of waiting to see how this is all going to play out. So super interesting. Thanks. All right, so first question, I really want to back up a bit since we have folks here who know a lot about tools and technology for responsible AI, and kind of go back to pre-LLM days. So like before ChatGPT was a thing and most commercial AI applications were just kind of traditional machine learning methods. Starting with you, Aparna, what did that look like? What were the common tools and best practices? Were people really using them, or was it still quite nascent? And what needs to change, and what of that tools and tech is still relevant for going forward with LLMs?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with, what does responsible AI and compliance look like for traditional ML? And by this, I mean just pre-LLMs. So typically when people think about observability, and again, my company Arize is the leading ML observability platform, the observability really meant getting a holistic view about your model. And typically that would involve things like what data scientists would care about is, well, how well is the model doing? And the metrics that they were typically, let's say, on the hook for typically involve things like the performance of the model. So if you're building an ads model, how well is the ads model actually leading to conversions? And there are metrics like fairness and bias evaluation type of metrics. So things like, again, let's just say you're building a credit card application model. Well, you care about, well, how many of those people that could have actually, paid off or were good, let's say, lenders, actually pay off the credit card every month. Or in some cases with let's just say a car loan, you're typically optimizing for some business KPI that you want to measure. There's other metrics that cared less about that business KPIs, but metrics like, well, are we being fair across different ethnic backgrounds, different gender backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds? And typically one of the common concerns, this data wasn't necessarily included in the building of the model. And so in some ways, some people would say, well, it wasn't included, so therefore my model is not biased. It didn't even have that data. But what a lot of people didn't realize was that it was actually the more and more features that people added into their data, it was actually pretty easy to correlate the results that they had to these biased type of inputs. And so it was almost like if I'm not including it, then we're not biased. When in the reality, just because you weren't necessarily including in your model didn't mean that you weren't biased. It just meant that there were still correlations. It just wasn't measured at the outcome. And so does that make sense? It was really kind of like a data scientist. If I had to summarize what I said, data scientists were largely put in charge of the performance of the model. Fairness and bias was kind of, something that was starting to be talked about, but there wasn't enough of the raw data to actually, they weren't given access to this type of data to actually be able to calculate those type of metrics. And so even with fairness and bias detection, metrics being out there and solutions being out there, I'd say it was still needed a lot of internal advocacy from data scientists to even be able to pull some of these metrics together. And I think there just wasn't a lot of push on it in companies that, hey, this is something we really should be measuring. It was almost like if we didn't measure it, then there's less risk for us. There's less risk that now we have to change some of our practices. And so figuring out what the bar is, what's actually doing well, what's not doing, there's no industry standards around this. And it was almost like if we didn't talk about it and we just didn't measure it, then no one would be able to call us out. Even though under the hood, there was probably bias in a lot of these models that are out there. And so this is one area where I think tools and solutions is one aspect of it, but I actually think a lot more of how do we make this a formalized process or a formalized regulation aspect of doing ML is something that I think we as a data science community just needs to be talking about more. And so now fast forward to LLMs, what I think is a little bit more nerve-wracking is that it actually, there's a good and a bad here. In the old world, every company was building its own model. So there could have been a lot of risk to them about publishing their own metrics about how biased. Now with organizations using a foundational model, there could be a lot more push to have these, maybe it's an OpenAI or maybe it's a Cohere, but there could be a lot more, well, if everyone's going to be using these 3 or 4 foundational models or these open source models, could we standardize on at least what are the KPIs for these LLMs? And so in that way, it could be easier because there's quote unquote less models. The hard part of this, I think, is these foundational models are using data from across the internet. And so figuring out what are the right metrics because I have, I know people who are using foundational models to do classification of some XYZ things. I know they're using them to do recommendations of XYZ things. And so figuring out what are the right metrics for all these different use cases. And then being able to point back to say, well, it's because it used this specific data source and doing the walk back to how do we go fix it, I think is going to be a whole other research and challenging problem. So hopefully that sets up the context for why this problem is so nuanced and so difficult.
Great setup. Yeah, I was just reminded. So Justin, I think you and I had spoken previously, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that you were talking about the legality of model bias. In fact, that it's not actually illegal. There's a finer point that you made on it. But let's kind of continue talking about what's different in this world of LLMs. I know that previously there was a lot of talk about explainability. When you're talking about big deep neural network foundation models, that kind of goes out the window. Also, if you're using someone else's ML through an API, the locus of control is completely different. So yeah, I would love to just kind of keep expanding on what's so different with LLMs.
Yeah, it's a great question, an important one. And just to follow up, the conversation we were having previously was about insurance companies and regulated industries actually allowing a form of bias as a part of their mitigation. Like it's a part of the way things are done. But you need to be able to explain it, and you need to be able to give reasons why your mitigation is the best you can do. And I think that's an important distinction between compliance, responsible use, and regulation, right? That there's levels of nuance along all of this. And so kind of taking that thread down into generative AI, I mean, there's just a ton to talk about here, but I like to think about sort of three different areas that have shifted. The first is that these transformer-based models, the T and the GPT, are actually not all that new, and that's usually the way it is in ML. But a technology becomes sort of more vanguard when there's a way to apply it to a new use case or to a new application, and that's exactly what happened here. There was a way that came up, sparing everyone the technical details of it, that allowed large parts of information to be learned in an efficient way by especially GPU assisted hardware, and spread over a tremendous amount of data. And we're not talking about now like what fits inside of even a set of servers. We're talking about petabyte and petabyte scale, taking weeks and weeks to train, and then coming up with something that's much more general, can answer questions from a wide range of different applications, domains, and use cases. And I think critically, the other part of this is, and we have to give credit where credit is due. OpenAI did provide a human interaction and interface that I don't think we had seen before, which was really clean, really natural, and it was like interacting in a Slack message or a text message with a friend. And all that conditioning put behind the model itself. So this is the API layer that is wrapped around all these things, made it feel like you were communicating with someone that you could trust. And so these models appeared confident, appeared trustworthy, and whether or not they were, that was the expectation that was then sort of garnered into the user population. And that's a really important point, because there's an expectation now set from everyone else like that they are credible. So now we've got big data, like really truly actually large data, and engineering around that. Now we have environmental concerns when you think about responsible use. You have truly wide domain that is kind of trained in that data. Now we have copyright and fair use and identity and brand protection issues that come out. And then you have this API layer, which is a human interaction and user research consideration, which is something I think we had worked on before, but because so few people were using it, it was sort of shoved into just like, okay, there's a chatbot used on someone's marketing website, like maybe they interact with it to try to buy a shirt. But now it's really something that everyone's doing as a part of their everyday lives. And I don't think all of our tools, our capabilities have caught up to that. And so, for example, at Vera, there are now new tools needed. At Vera, we're building some of these things that are bidirectional. Like you can't just be concerned about a deterministic outcome that you get from a website and then protecting that with a firewall. You have to be concerned about what's going into it. from from the user's perspective, from your perspective as a user. And then when it comes back, there's all kinds of decisions to be made about what's acceptable to be presented to someone, and what we expect for that to look like as the information changes modes. If it's not just text, what about images, video, audio, all these other things that are being stitched together? And so we're thinking about this in a way that there's actually a sort of baseline safety requirement that there needs to be, right? So we need to make sure that users and the models themselves are kept safe. But then there's an aspect of control, which I think you have in a lot of other software engineering and software development pathways that just don't exist at the moment in the same way in generative tech. So there's policies that a company or an organization or even a person, you said every day, you don't want to sell your data, for example, to a specific vendor, but you're okay with it for another. You're interested in seeing anatomy, but you don't want to see pornography. There's very nuanced, sort of policy and compliance decisions that need to be made here. And so we need new tool sets that allow for that granular control, both for organizations, for individuals. And we cannot, assume that these large, very well-funded, maybe don't have all our interests in the best and in mind. We can't allow them to control what we see and assume that they're going to have all their best interests in mind. And the last thing I'll mention on this is one good thing that's happening is that we are having sort of a parallel rise of open source start to come up and take the vanguard away from only these really well-funded venture-backed and publicly traded companies. But the downside of that is we don't get all the scaffolding and the regulatory safety that those big companies are beholden to. And so, now we need to think about how, if we're going to use a family or a portfolio of different models, a portfolio of different applications and APIs, how do we have consistency and normalization about the experience from a safety and regulatory perspective? So these are the things that we're thinking about a lot at Vera and building tools for. But I think just as general users, all of us, these are the types of things we have to keep in mind as the world sort of matures in generative.
Absolutely. But before we move on, like Tamara, I'd love to get your take here, given that you're focused on the societal impacts. And Justin's already touched on this, but is there anything that like kind of a big one or two things that you guys are thinking on in your research center when it comes to LLMs, specifically because of how they work and how they're deployed?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think for our organization, one of the areas that we've really been trying to focus on is labor impact. So thinking about how LLMs are imagined to kind of disrupt the labor market versus, what is actually happening in reality, and thinking about sort of how different labor unions, including, SAG-AFTRA and WGA, are attempting to kind of imagine what the repercussions of generative AI will be down the road. And so, what does it mean for actors to think about, basically simulacra versions of themselves, being used to have them act in commercials without their consent many years down the road. And so I think a thing that comes up very frequently with LLMs is the matter of consent and knowledge of what it is that you're interacting with. And so, we have seen repeatedly also the idea that we can replace a human interlocutor with LLMs because they're like a close enough approximation, and we've seen the devastating effects that can have, particularly when people try to rely on generative AI to perform therapy, or to kind of act in some sort of medical context. And so I think we really need to be aware of the harms that are already happening in the world, document them, and really work with, as we've talked about already, the use cases for generative AI are so many that it can be very difficult to even keep track of all the different ways that we can think about repercussions on different marginalized communities. And so that is something that we've been really grappling with as an organization, and I think for everyone who is sort of really worried about the ethical impacts.
Yes, we have our work cut out for us. It's just interesting, kind of going back to the beginning of this conversation, pre-LLMs, things were still difficult, and now we have this massive technology unleashed at a much larger scale to much many more people. So I guess the next question is this new regulatory effort, the likes of the EU AI Act, NIST AI framework, which is not a regulation, but just a framework, how much is that going to help? And so I would love to ask this of you, Nicolette. How do you see regulatory policy taking shape in the US, federal, state, in other countries, cross national efforts, for countries to get together and work on these things together? What's your view of things? Do you think it's going to work? How it's going to affect you in your role as well? Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's a pretty wide, big question to answer. I think a lot of countries are trying to move forward with regulation. Obviously, I can start with in the EU, right? The EU has the talks of this act have started years ago, right? And it was kind of put into motion, and then you'll see very quickly the talks pivoting earlier this year when everyone started talking about ChatGPT and LLMs, right? They started really focusing on that. So the pages of the act all changed, and lots of new sections got added with adding regulations with regards to LLMs and these kinds of technologies. And those are still kind of moving. Even I think the latest talks were this morning in Brussels, and I don't think that they've come to consensus, which means that it probably won't be passed in this calendar year, and we're probably looking at something like February before it gets passed. I haven't read every page of the act, so I can't go into detail about it, but I think it is going to be very difficult for me to say here any kind of with certainty what it is going to impact how it's going to impact any company, because you really need working party guidance of it's going to come out, it's going to be 1,000 pages long, and then like we saw with GDPR, you're going to get working party guidance, and that's really going to be what people are going to look at. I think it's very hard to speculate about the EU AI Act right now, and I know everyone wants an answer, even our own customers, like, how are you preparing? And I'm like, I'm preparing by watching it very closely and seeing where it ends up. Even with this idea of high risk systems, you can, by definition, in theory, become a high risk system if you are even in the world of hiring, like we are at Beamery. And then there's an avenue where you can apply to take yourself out of that category, right? So kind of like Justin said earlier, there's regulation, and then there's how do you get yourself out of the regulation in a sense? So it's very hard for me to speculate on it, although I just say everyone watch it very closely. And there is the nice thing with the EU, unlike the US, is that they pass a law and then they give you about 2 to 3 years before they enforce it. So it is I think it's just a little bit too early to speculate about the EU AI Act and how the impact it's going to have. It's going to have an impact, right? GDPR had a huge impact. A lot of people liken the law to GDPR. There'll be a lot of preparations. You will see 1,000 new vendors pop up to help you with compliance. Like all the effort, everything you need for compliance will be there. So I've got no worries that companies can't get compliant. It just and people can prepare once it's passed, because there's lots and lots of time. So I wouldn't worry about it quite yet. I think there's a lot of worry, but it's kind of unfounded at the moment. With regards to the US, you see, I don't think there is going to be a sweeping AI law in the States, like a federal law. We don't have a sweeping AI privacy law. I doubt we're going to get a sweeping federal law, just because of the way we enforce laws, right? We have so many different agencies. They like to do it based on sector. So we'll likely see more sector specific laws, and then we'll probably see, like we've seen come out of the White House, some white papers, some guidance about good standards and good ethics and things like that. But I doubt we will see a federal law. That could change, right? Because there's also these are politicians, and this could be I think it's something a lot of people across the aisle agree on in terms of regulating AI. So this might actually be one you see come out of, you know, both parties being like, hey, look, we're working together. So, and it seems like an easy win for both parties. So you will see that, but then, you know, you've got special interests, you'll have a lot of groups, because like I said, and all the peers have said that this technology is not just in finance, it's not just in hiring, it's basically going to be everywhere. In, you know, every company back in the day used to be, I used to be a credit card company, used to be a car company, and then every company changed their slogan to, we are a tech company that does cars, that does cards, that does this. And soon you'll see every single company is going to say, we're an AI company that does this. And so obviously there's going to be a lot of interest in how regulation takes shape. But there are, you know, in some of these fields, there are longstanding laws that do already regulate some of the work. You know, obviously our company is in the talent and HR space, so we follow the EEOC very closely, and Commissioner Keith Sunderling talks a lot about AI and hiring, and, you know, he kind of talks a lot about how there are longstanding guidelines against discrimination, whether that happens by a person or whether that happens by a machine. And so he, you know, that those laws are in effect no matter how you get to the decision, no matter if it's the tool making it, and you can't hide behind a tool, right? So he wants to make that clear that, you know, this discrimination by a tool is not, employers can't get out of that. And you can see, you will start to see a lot more enforcement in the space. I think there's actually a big class action trying to form right now against a big ATS. So we'll see kind of how that plays out, because in the States, obviously, a lot of our laws are based on the outcomes of court cases. So we'll see kind of, I think we're going to see a lot more legislation in the space. I think we're going to see a lot more plaintiff-based legislation in the space, class actions in this space, because people are aware of it. You know, I do truly think that maybe the regular person, you know, might not understand how much of their life is already kind of surrounded by AI and algorithms, you know, credit applications, loan applications, hiring, you know, med on demand, things like that. But, you know, those are all kind of done by algorithm. And I don't think a lot of people have kind of caught on to that until AI has now become the topic du jour, and every, you know, even your grandma's talking about it. So I do think we will see a lot of plaintiff side cases in the US. Obviously, it doesn't work like that in the EU. So that's all going to have to come from regulation, and we'll see how that pans out there. In the States also, you don't actually see, in the EU AI Act, we have seen they have distinguished between types of models, right? And in the States, from what we've seen, you haven't seen that distinguishment between whether it's an LLM, whether it's a homegrown algorithm that you built in-house, or whether you bought it. So I don't know if we'll see that there either. I don't think they're distinguishing that much on it. What else can I say? You do see actually a lot of movement on legislation coming out of China, which I think is also trying to be a leader in regulation and kind of trying to set a standard. You know, take that how you will, because presumably the Chinese government's exempt from some of those rules themselves. So yeah, but I do think they're taking a stance on regulation. Singapore is another great example of, they've got a great set of standards that are not binding, but they do expect a lot of their institutions, for example, banks, to abide by them. And so they've got a good, if you're looking for kind of principles and kind of sample regs to look at, Singapore's are really good. What else? Maybe, and if anyone else on the panel wants to talk about regulation, I'm happy to kind of give more thoughts on any one of them.
I mean, I just wanted to add actually two things based off of what you said, Nicolette. One is, you're so right. I always say, probably between the time you woke up to the time folks are listening to this panel, you've probably interacted with 100, maybe even 1,000 plus models, and you're just not aware of it. Everything from what news you read in the morning on your app was a recommendation model. And so there's so much you check your weather, if you check your mail, there's just so many models behind every single thing that we interact with day to day. And whether it's LLM or not LLM, I think that that is now starting to become more and more discussed. I know that we chatted about, okay, well, regulation's probably going to be one of the things that pushes this type of, responsible AI into motion. But on a positive note, one thing I just wanted to add was like, there's a lot of cool grounds up work that's happening from the tech community. And I think on the LLM side, one that just might be interesting to share is, okay, so it's a little circular, but we are seeing people using AI to evaluate AI now. So almost using AI to say, hey, here was my response. And then, if you're asking a question and then it gave a response, and then asking, well, was the response biased in some way? And so, you might call it circular, but it's really not that much more circular than humans grade other humans' assignments. Humans evaluate one another for job applications. And so if AI is growing in intelligence, AI can have, and it's going to take work, but I think there's a question that is one that we've all been testing and building on the ground up, which is, can AI evaluate itself to determine not just accuracy of the model, but also, or accuracy of the responses, but also, is it fair? Is it responding in any kind of biased way? Is it rude? Is it toxic in its answers? And these are all ways that we can start to get signal. And so I just wanted to highlight something that's happening in the grounds up kind of motion. I think as it'll take a while to figure out regulation.
Yeah, and if I could just take that a bit farther, this is actually something that we're really focused on at Vera as we're thinking about compliance and enforcement and compliance. I think this takes it into, there's a question in the chat from GoFriend about the international community and how we're going to deviate from this like US centric view of how every model is supposed to interact, and how what the regulatory landscape is going to be like for that. But the reality is that these hundreds and thousands of models are actually going to be operating all over the world, and many different types of people with different cultures, different expectations. So Aparna, to your point, it may be toxic one place, not toxic another. It may be evaluated as sensitive in one place and not in the others. And we already see that with Europe, where they're much more sensitive about PII than we are in the US. And so, one of the things that I think is really powerful actually about where we're going from a tools perspective is that now that we are starting to see standards come out, maybe not regulation, but standards, we're seeing from the ground up, to Aparna's point, tools and techniques that can help us to meet, the standard to some degree of confidence. Now, can we go across, these models and sort of a more real time or more transparent to the user perspective, and allow them to have the experience where they're supposed to be according to where they live in the world and according to that set of culture. And so a model that we have for this, which is funny, but people probably don't think about it, is security. So it turns out that like security context and how you're safeguarded on an application perspective changes all over the time, all over the world. Firewalls interact with you, content management or content delivery systems interact with you, and you're completely not aware of it, but it's very customized to who you are and where you are. And that took a lot of time. It took time to build what is the regulation, the law going to have to say, and then took time to build, okay, well, what's acceptable for a region? And then also, how are we going to enforce that, and where are we going to force that regionally? So I think we're starting to see some of the scaffolding come up in the side of ML. And, in fact, I think generative has actually forced us to push a bit farther and faster on that, which is in my opinion, a good thing.
I agree. And to kind of echo that with regards to security, what you may see is, in the absence of hard letter legislation, you may see something that we have similar to security today is like, even GDPR says you need to implement technical and organizational measures to keep, to protect data. And so you might see something similar, like you need to implement certain measures to keep your AI, safe, prevent harm, like, prevent legal impacts on people, but without actually spelling that out. And then you use industry standards like ISO, NIST, SOC and then you get audited against those standards. So you might see that coming up where actually business drives that, right? We can't sell to a single, if we weren't ISO and SOC compliant, we would never get a deal, right? So you might see the same thing happen with AI and be like, your models have to be, have an assessment. When we realize what a good assessment is, when we figure that out, they need to be, follow the NIST guidelines, this, et cetera. So and whether that comes from regulation or not, that'll probably come from industry, because every single person is going to have their checklist for procurement, I think in particular, or internal development, and it'll have to follow these certain standards, and those might be higher than what the minimum thresholds are for the law. So we'll probably see that develop, I think, when we get that more standards out there. But yeah, well, I think that's going to be coming soon.
So while we're waiting, because it sounds like, we know these things are coming, whether it's the more industrial kind of standards or policy and legal regulatory policies. What if I'm a business, large or small, and I'm saying, hey, I'm in the United States, but I know I'm going to want to go to market in Europe. In any case, I don't want litigation. I want to be a good steward. What types of things should organizations start doing today? Whether it's process, people, education, tools, technology. What are some good tips that we can give our audience to get started on today?
Well,
I'll start with you, Tamara. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nicolette, and then we'll go over to you, Tamara.
I'm just going to give a short answer, is that I think anyone who is developing or procuring models, put as much documentation into your process as possible. Write things down, because you will forget them when it comes time to filling out these questionnaires, to writing it. So the best thing I can encourage is, if you're in compliance or if you're building this stuff, like, write it down. Write down what's going into it. Document processes. Document who worked on it, because one typical question I see in AI questionnaires is, was there a diversity of the people that worked on the team to create this product, right? They want to know about the makeup of the humans that made the product, because that, as we know, that could influence the outcomes of certain models. So I would put as much documentation in place now, in the absence of regulation, so that when regulation does come, or you do want to go to market with your models, you can, it's a lot easier that way. So document is all I can say.
Yeah, I think your point about sort of thinking about the diversity of the tech workforce that is actually designing and creating the systems is really an important one. Another thing that I think has been helpful is, researchers at Stanford, for example, kind of compare different foundation models side by side according to different metrics. So, what does a model look like if you think about its relationship to bias, or what does it look like if you think about environmental impact? And then we can further unpack what environmental impact means. And so I think what's really important is for developers and others within tech companies to be very well educated on different trade-offs. So when you're making decisions about what a system can look like, are you thinking about the carbon cost of what you're building? Are you also thinking about the water cost? How are you actually calculating environmental impacts? Are you looking at the entire life cycle, or are you mostly looking at the training phase and not really thinking about what happens after a system is deployed or when it's sunsetted? And so I think, what organizations can do in order to really prepare for legislation that is likely to come at them in the next few years is make sure that there are people within your organization who know how to build products that will be compliant. And that was a big gap that I saw at my former tech job, was, a lot of people who were very passionate, who wanted to make a difference, who wanted to build sustainable and responsible technology, but they didn't necessarily have the knowledge or tools to do so. And so making sure that there are more certificate training programs available, and obviously industry-wide standards that are actually actionable, though. And that's the other thing, that gap between, a framework that NIST can put out and what is actually going to happen when it comes time to think about business decisions and the bottom line. The other issue that is really important is actually having executive buy-in and support. And so if responsible AI and sustainability in relation to AI are not part of the organization-wide OKRs and are not a main priority of leadership, then it will not happen. People who are developers are only going to have so much control over what they're doing if leadership doesn't care. And so making sure that there are more training programs also for C-suite to actually get on board with this stuff is really important, because what we have is a big divide where we have a lot of women and people of color who are the ethics folks who are brought into tech, people who are often not in real positions of power within a tech company. And so if you want to be able to actually build more ethical and responsible technology, you need to empower those folks. The other thing is making sure that you're bringing communities and other stakeholders into the conversation as early as possible, and really thinking very carefully about who might be impacted. And something that we've really been trying to do with AIMLab is get in and work with companies and organizations when they're still in the very early phase of even planning a project. So, having us kind of hang out with potential vendors and start thinking about who might be impacted communities when they implement a certain technology, that allows them to, really think about downstream impacts before they actually build a thing, rather than the auditing, which of course is something that should also be done in tandem with impact assessments. I think that they are actually a thing that should go together every single time. And I know, we should probably talk a little bit more about Vera and Arize specifically, in case people have any questions about sort of how those technologies actually work.
Yeah, I know we're starting to get towards the end of time. So, and I know we have a one or two questions that we didn't quite get to yet. So, kind of try to wrap this up with a 30 seconds, one final call to action that you'd like to share with the audience and the world when it comes to being responsible and compliant with generative AI. My call to action is absolutely encourage the audience to follow up with this awesome expert panel. I'm sure they'd be happy to hear from you on LinkedIn, have a lot more knowledge to share. Definitely check out Vera and Arize AI. These are wonderful tools that are very actionable technology that you can use today to get ahead of this. With that, I'll start with you, Aparna. What's your one call to action?
I think figuring out how, I think one that's in the control of the developer, and maybe I'll start there because I think, Tamara covered all the C-suite needs to be educated on this, but from a developer perspective, from a technical perspective, figuring out what metric is, I think, something that's very much in the control of a developer. And what I mean by that is not just thinking about accuracy or how the model's doing, but how do we measure toxic for this use case? How do we measure if something's biased? How do we want to do that? I think is something that brings all of the hypothetical to something that's very concrete and methodical, and you might need iteration. It might not be perfect the first time, but I think it's a great starting point. And I think, as the folks have been saying here, that's kind of like the bridge between the talking about this to actually doing something about it. And I think, as Justin would probably say, once you get down to the metric, these are things that we could start to quantify, measure in platforms like ours. And I think that the more people do that, the more that we just have data to be able to talk about this in an informed way. So that'd be my one ask.
Great. Justin.
Yeah, I think drafting off of what everybody's been saying, excellent points. So I think I've alluded to it before, but I would have a call to action for everyone involved. So the developer, the enterprise as a whole, the executive community, boards, and the user population, all of us, like, let's not, assume that we're going to inherit a warm and fuzzy, wonderful world from these large scale cloud providers. Like they are doing, in some cases, their best, and in some cases, they're doing exactly what is in the best interest of their shareholders. So it's our responsibility, every person in that community, to approach, safeguarding the DevOps process, the MLOps process, and then also all the apps that come downstream of these generative technologies. Like, we need to be constantly assessing, sending feedback about what we expect from them, and what our safety posture is going to be. And I think that helps to drive all this conversation forward, and also, again, drives the tools, because the market will respond to what we use and what we accept. And just to put a point at that, I think it's also important for us all to develop a sense and start to be a bit deliberate about what this kind of generative tech is good at and what it's bad at. It's not good at everything. And so it's not useful for every use case. And so rather than expecting, to build for or use the generative technology for everything we need to do, we should be specific about where it's going to add value, and then work on hardening that. So that would be what I would lead with.
Thank you. Nicolette.
Yeah, I've got two. One very practical, which is I think people are really freaking out about AI regulation, and laws have been around since the beginning of time, really, and humanity started governing itself. So these are just another set of laws. Your company complies with lots of laws today. They will find a way to be compliant with coming laws, and so I wouldn't freak out just yet. Rely on your in-house counsel, and your lawyer. But and then my more philosophical call to action is, my hope for this technology and what I want to see regulation do is fraud and push AI developers and people who use this technology and deploy it to drive good outcomes for humanity, right? I think about Beamery and what we're trying to accomplish with our technology, and I think that it's a sense of good, and trying to force more diverse outcomes in the hiring process, and hopefully with regulation and with safeguards and with kind of thinking about the ethics behind this, we can force companies to use this as a force of good to drive some change, right? Which is kind of what we want to see, whether it's climate change in the good way, hiring changes, medical outcomes, right? We want to force it to be a force for good and drive change in humanity. So I think that we should hold, like you said, Justin, companies to account, and use the tech and all this for a force of good and a force of change.
Absolutely. Okay, Tamara, and the last word goes to you.
I think generative AI, particularly because of all of the panic and honestly hype around what it can possibly do, it's an opportunity for us to really think very carefully about our relationship to technology and its role in inequality, but also potentially justice. And so how do you incorporate frameworks for justice and equity into, conversations about standards, and kind of trying to measure what the impact of generative AI may be? So I'm really hoping that we can focus more on the human and sort of environmental impacts of all of our technologies, not just generative AI, and really think about what the costs are as we kind of ramp up development of things and implement them without really thinking about the full consequences.
Well, thank you all so much. I've definitely gained some confidence just knowing that you all are positioned out there working on the solutions, involved in the discussion. So I think we definitely have our work cut out for us. So I want to thank you so much, and thanks to our audience. Apologies that we didn't get to all the questions, but I encourage everyone to reach out to the panel, find them on LinkedIn, and I will be sending you all a replay and some links to more resources and information. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Me too.